All right. Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to see everybody. I'm going to put everyone on mute as we get started. Since the hour is now exactly 10 o'clock, we have a lot to cover today, beginning with a little bit of contextualization from me. It's good to see everyone this morning. Thank you. This is our last in the series. We're going to be looking at some issues from the 20th century that have certainly bled over into the 21st century. I will share with you that of all of the sessions, this was in some way the hardest for me to try to compile. Um, and I say that because it's hard to do history in a contemporary period. If you ask a proper historian, they will say that nothing in the last 30 to 40 years can really be looked at through a historical lens because it's simply too new. And while we're certainly going to look back at more than just the last 30 years, we're going to look back over, going back 100 years and getting a little bit more recently to about 30, almost 40 years ago. Um, it's still a little fresh in our mind. Not to mention the events of the 20th century were, for lack of a better word, plentiful. And the growth of the American Jewish community in the 20th century and the diversity of the American Jewish experience in the 20th century was plentiful. So I chose a couple of things to look at today, which I'm saying the caveat, which is this is not meant to be a lesson of the Jewish experience of the 20th century, not by any stretch of the imagination. This is a couple of things that I have chosen to explore that come out of the 20th century that I think the effects of which are continuing to be felt and being processed and being experienced now that we are almost a quarter of a way through the 21st century. But as you'll see, this I certainly put my thumb on the scale for what I think is important to look at. And when I say I mean us and our community here at Temple Bethel. All right, having made that caveat, here we go. So if you remember, for those of you who were with us on the very first day, we said that we were going to look at four different periods in these four classes, right? The first week we looked at the colonial and revolutionary period. We looked at questions of anti-Semitism in New Amsterdam and President Washington, his letter to Toro, what was going on in France at the turn of the 19th century. We looked at moments from the Civil War, and in particular, some arguments on behalf of Jewish Confederate soldiers, and then the whole incident with Grant's General Orders number 11 and President Lincoln and the Jews of Paducah, Kentucky, lobbying for Jewish acceptance during the Civil War. We looked last week at some questions around immigration and the rise of the modern movements in America. And today we're going to look at the sort of catch-all contemporary. And I think this speaks to that issue of doing modern history, which is we don't really know what this is going to mean in some ways. We know what it's meant for us in our own generation, but we'll see that there is some applicability of some of the questions we explore today that go beyond how they applied in the first place. So what do I mean by that? Well, we're going to look at the question of the MS St. Louis. And we know that that was an incident and an episode in American Jewish history that was certainly troublesome and bothersome to the Jewish community for obvious reasons, right? And the way in which the US government handled that situation, I would say, is problematic. But we're going to look at, I think, a greater context of what was going on. And the source that I pulled, I think, is one that is really interesting more so from a Jewish perspective than from a American perspective. We're going to look at the question of women in the rabbinate, and in particular, the ways in which our movement wrestled with that question, not in the 1960s and 70s, but much earlier. And then we're going to look at the question of patrilineal descent and look at the resolution that was passed by the CCAR in 1983 on that question. In my mind, if you look at the question of women in the rabbinate, if you look at the question of patrilineal descent, those two issues within the organized Jewish world of the 20th century, in some ways, I think you can say are the most hot button, in the sense that that is where the majority of tension within the Jewish community could be situated. That is where our movement initially diverted from the other movements. Some of the other movements came along with us. Some of them did not. And who and how on those two questions continues to be a varied answer. And the question of women in the rabbinate in particular also, I think, laid the groundwork for other questions of other groups in the rabbinate, in particular, the LGBTQ plus community. Some of the questions that were asked about could women serve in the rabbinate, you could ask the same question, and the trajectory of answering that question, I think, mirrors the question of women in the rabbinate as well. Questions so far? Anyone wanted to jump in before we jump in? Okay, very good. All right. So the story of the MS St. Louis, right? We know this is the story of that ship that sailed from Europe with Jewish refugees from Germany trying to escape the Holocaust, trying to escape the Shoah, and had difficulty finding port really anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, and ultimately was sent back. You can read all about this in various places, but this particular document I had never seen before. This is the testament or the testimonial that was inscribed at Yad Vashem, at the Israeli Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem. And for those of you who are not familiar with Yad Vashem, you know that there's one section of the Museum and Memorial that is called what they call the righteous among the nations, right? Where they recognize those non-Jews who did things to benefit Jews during World War II. The captain of the MS St. Louis, Gustav Schröder, was recognized at Yad Vashem as a righteous among the Gentiles. And this write-up that they put together encapsulates the events, I think, fairly straightforwardly, and gives us a really interesting full picture of the event. Gustav Schröder was a captain of the fateful voyage of the St. Louis, which in May 1939 set sail from Hamburg to Havana, Cuba, with more than 900 Jewish passengers aboard. The Jewish passengers who had applied for US visas had to wait until their quota numbers became valid before they could enter the United States. We're hoping to stay in Cuba until that time. Many of them had already been arrested in the wake of Kristallnacht in November of 1938 and had to leave Nazi Germany in order to prevent being arrested again. The hopeful passengers who had bought Cuban landing permits, and transit visas from a Cuban official were not aware that these documents were invalidated by Cuba's president several days before the ship had sailed. When the St. Louis arrived in Havana on May 1939, only 22 Jewish passengers with valid US visas were allowed to disembark. This is only a third of the story, but I wanted to stop here, right? One of the things that I have learned in studying the story of the St. Louis is that many of us, myself included, carried that Hollywoodized version of the story, right? And the Hollywoodized version of the story even has a Hollywoodized title of the story. Anyone know the name of the title of the film that was made? Brian, you want to yell it out?
Fools.
Say it again, Brian.
Ship of Fools.
Well, that's not what I was thinking. There's a different one, The Voyage of the Damned, right?
That's another one, but Ship of Fools was another one. Hey, very strong on TCM and movies of the 30s and 40s.
Anyone want to guess what percentage of these 900 Jewish passengers survived? Survived World War II?
Guess less than 10%.
Less than 10% survived?
I guess.
So the interesting thing, any other guesses?
About 15 to 20%.
Okay, other guesses? It's actually the inverse. The majority of passengers ended up surviving the war. They found passage out of Germany. Some of them were into the camps and survived. And listen, I am not saying this to make any kind of minimization of the tragedy of the St. Louis. I only push back because if you look at what is often read as an epi, if you think about the movie The Voyage of the Damned, it often says, and the majority of them, the case was much more complicated and much more convoluted, which isn't to say that at a certain point, the bureaucrats who were responsible for making these decisions should have seen the forest for the trees, should have made it a lot less complicated than they had birthed to. They should have said, listen, you don't have papers, we don't care. We're going to do the right thing. And that didn't happen here, which is why Gustav Schroeder was recognized as a righteous among the Gentile by Yad Vashem, because he did everything he could to try to get these passengers unloaded in the Western Hemisphere, and was stopped over and over and over again by bureaucrats who were just following instructions on a piece of paper and looking at numbers on a piece of paper. So here we go. We get to Cuba on May of 39, and of the 900 passengers, 22 are allowed to disembark. They have valid U.S. visas. So what does Schroeder do next? The next thing he does, the others who were refused entry. Another Jewish passenger tried to commit suicide and was taken to a hospital in Havana. The plight of the ship's passengers was reported in the media, and Jewish organizations, and in particular, the Joint really was the leader in that effort, tried to negotiate on behalf of the passengers, but in vain. And there's the story of Schroeder sailing up and down the coast trying to find a place to go. The pariah ship was forced to turn back to Europe. However, knowing that his passengers risked being arrested if they returned to Germany, Captain Schroeder decided not to head straight back to a German harbor. Refusing to return to Germany until he had found a safe haven for his Jewish passengers, the captain stalled on the voyage back and took a route sailing so close to the Florida shore that the passengers could see the lights of Miami, in a hope that the United States would agree to let the desperate Jewish passengers land. Schroeder even went so far as to develop a contingency plan by which the St. Louis was to be spectacularly shipwrecked near the English coast in order to force the British authorities to take some action. Finally, however, a solution was found, and the passengers allowed to disembark in Antwerp after Belgium, Great Britain, and France had come to an agreement with the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee to each take in a certain number of people. Belgium and France were occupied by Germany in 1940, and the passengers who had landed there were again under Nazi rule. But since they already had immigration quota numbers, most of them were able to reach the United States before the immigration of Jews was suspended by the Nazi authorities. It was thus primarily thanks to Captain Schroeder's courage and determination not to abandon his Jewish passengers to their fates that many of them were able to escape the Nazi death trap. On March 11, 1993, Yad Vashem recognized Captain Gustav Schroeder as a righteous among the nations. That is not the story that I learned in Hebrew school. That is not the story that I have learned in different events, by the way, including events at Temple Bethel of Boca Raton. You may remember several years ago that we had that play production of a local playwright who wrote a story, a fictionalized trial of President Roosevelt around the question of his treatment of the Jews of the MS St. Louis. I only say that because clearly the US government did not follow the clear message of the new Colossus that Emma Lazarus wrote, right? That wretched refuse yearning to be free could not be better applied to a group of people than the Jews on the MS St. Louis. And for a whole bunch of reasons, the US administration was not interested in suspending its own policies to meet this obvious need. That's one piece of the story that we're not questioning here, even though groups like the Joint tried so hard to do that. On the other hand, if we look at the story a little more holistically, we look at how the world responded, we see that it wasn't that the ship was returned to Germany and all of the passengers disembarked from the ship and were marched directly into Nazi death camps, which is often how the end of the story is told in American Jewish circles. I feel like I'm Paul Harvey for a second here. Anyone listen to Paul Harvey when they were younger? And the rest of the story, right? The rest of the story is a little more complicated than I think the Jewish community likes to talk about. We like to say, look how awful FDR was. Look how awful the Jews were treated. It would have been much better had they been to disembark either in Cuba or in the US, no questions asked. But I take comfort to know that there was a man like Gustav Schroeder who did what he had to do, who waited and delayed and tried and tried and tried to the point where the majority of the passengers actually were to survive what would have been certain death had they stayed in Germany because of his machinations. Questions, comments, insights? Jack, go ahead.
Yeah, I was under the impression
Me too.
that, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I was under the impression that the Germans informed the Cubans that there was a disease on that ship. Is that true?
I am not in a place to confirm or deny that. I didn't come across that when I was, and I'll be really honest, I was looking for something that captured this piece of the story, and the write-up of Gustav Schroeder was brilliant, right? I didn't get into the internal politics of what the Germans were trying to do. We could have spent the entire hour talking about the debates that went on at the highest echelons of American government about why they wouldn't open the port. That just wasn't where I went in preparing for this. And so my answer is, you very well might be right. You might be wrong. I appreciate the question, and I'm not in a position to answer it. Roberta asked, why didn't he try to land near Susa? Roberta, say more.
So Susa in the Dominican Republic, which was a Jewish community because Batista allowed Jews in.
So again, I have no idea. What we know is that the passengers were trying to get to America, right? And some of them were able to, as we see that they had numbers, right? They didn't have visas, but they were on the immigration quota list, and that was their goal. And so why he didn't go there, I have no idea, right? That he might have known that there was a Jewish. Listen, like, who knows what was going on in his mind? He was probably listening to what his passengers were telling him they wanted to do. And he was trying to do right by them, if I had to make a guess. Great question. I have no idea. I feel like I'm failing today.
No, but it's an interesting little piece of World War II history. Many of the people there came to the States. But if you go to the Dominican Republic and visit the town, you'll still see a big sign that says Katz's, and you'll see other remnants, although there are very few Jews left. They actually started the cattle industry in the Dominican Republic. But that said, Hitler used this as propaganda, saying, see, no one else wants the Jews either, no one cares.
Right. Other questions? Other thing before we move on. Actually, we're going to move back in history, but forward in progress, I'll suggest. All right. So moving away, and again, we're skipping really quickly over World War II, the founding of the state, all that stuff. Like I'm deliberately not talking about Israel in this conversation today because we're focusing on questions of American Jewry. The question of Zionism and the question of the support of the state of Israel was an important one in the American Jewish story. There's no question about that, and the various factions and how they mobilized politically. But I'm going somewhere else today. When was the first woman ordained in the U.S.?
Sometime during the 70s.
Yeah, Sally Prezant was ordained in 75, 76, somewhere around there, maybe earlier, but it was in the 1970s, right? And it was the Hebrew Union College, right, my alma mater, that ordained the first woman, at least in America. We know that there were stories of Regina Jonas, who was ordained in Germany, and the question there were other women in Jewish history who served in rabbinic roles, and some of whom were ordained in Europe. The question of Rashi's daughter, for example. But in America, it's accepted that Sally Prezant was the first woman who was ordained. And that was in the 1970s, right? And who had the authority, who has the authority, at least within the reform movement, to ordain people? Any guesses?
Guess. President of HUC?
Yeah, I mean, we'll call it the college, right? The Hebrew Union College, right, which is the Reform Movement seminary, and whether that authority rests in the Board of Governors, which is the ultimate governing body, or in the president of the college, or in one of the other administrators. But HUC is the ordaining body, and there's an interesting. The Reform Movement in America kind of exists on three pillars, right? And those pillars include the synagogues, right, which is represented by what was the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, now the Union for Reform Judaism. That is the conglomeration, that is the membership organization for the synagogues. What's one leg? The second leg is the Hebrew Union College, the seminary, right, which is the intellectual hub of the movement that ordains rabbis and cantors and trains other Jewish professionals, but also grants graduate degrees in various courses of study, right, including PhDs in research. And has other programs as well. There was a time when there was an undergraduate program there as well. And it's had programming for college students and for high school students, but it's the intellectual hub. And then you have the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, who I think today we can also expand that so that the CCAR can also represent the American College of Cantors. It can present the ARJE, the movement, the group of educators, and NADA, the group of temple administrators, right? But the idea is you've got sort of the professional organizations, you've got the synagogue organization, and you've got the educational organization, the college. Those are sort of the three pieces. Missing from all that are the people themselves, right? The various groups represented, the men of Reform Judaism, women of Reform Judaism. I think that that there's different pieces to it, but from a policy perspective, and from a whose voices are echo the most clearly, the voice of the president of the union, the voice of the president of the college, or the college itself, and the voice of the CCAR kind of tended to be in history the three leading voices of the movement. Right. What was interesting, if for those of you who follow the movement in modern times, know that a few weeks ago there was a statement put out about support of Black Lives Matter as a concept that from the reform movement. But there were about 24 organizations whose leadership signed on to that statement, right? Yes, the union, yes, the college, yes, the Central Conference, and the ACC, and ARGE, and NADA, and the men of and the women of Reform Judaism, and NIFTY, the teen organization, right? And the pension, right? The Reform Pension Board, right? Which is the 403B that Jewish professionals, Reform Jewish professionals get, like literally all these different groups added their name to it, which I thought was really interesting. The idea that it's not just the union, the college, and the conference whose voices should be clear in 2020, it should be wider. But in the 1920s, where we're going to get to in a moment, really, and in particular the question of women in the rabbinate, there were really two institutions whose opinions were the most operative. One was the conference, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, who would be tasked with asking and answering the question, does Jewish tradition allow for women to be ordained? And then the college would have to answer the question from a policy perspective, as an institution of higher learning, will we accept women as students and actually ordain them? The union gets involved in the third piece, which is to say, what is the union's position going to be on its membership hiring women as rabbis, right? Because it's one thing to allow them to go into school. It's a second thing to allow women to be ordained. If the union is not going to protect women and their employment opportunities, it all might be moot. Because if you can get a degree but not employment, then what are you going to do? Robin.
In the 1920s, Hebrew Union College and Jewish Institute of Religion were two different institutions. So did they think alike on this, or who are we talking about when we talk about the college?
Speak mostly about the college and not JIR, because I don't know its history as well. But do they think alike? I think the answer to that is yes, and we'll see how in a moment. So, In 1922, the CCAR took it upon itself to write a responsum, right? And for those of you who aren't familiar with the idea of a responsum, for basically the last 600 or 700 years, if not longer, the way in which questions of Jewish law have been answered, both by Reform, conservative, is this idea of what is known in the tradition as shut. Shut is a Hebrew acronym for the phrase she'elot, meaning questions, and tshuvot, answers. Questions and answers. She'elot and tshuvot, shut. Basically, after the Talmud was completed, and after the completion of the law codes, the Shulchan Aruch and the Mishnah Torah, once we get like into the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, the writing of Jewish law has been completed. What happens next is individual questions of how do we interpret that law, or how do we apply that law to a circumstance which the law itself is not explicit on, gets raised. It's kind of like common law, but different, but there's a similarity there. So for example, and I taught about this about a year ago, some of you might remember that we talked about the question of the extinguishing of a gas stove on a festival, right? So while the laws of Shabbat don't allow for either the lighting of fire or the extinguishing of fire, when it comes to the three festivals and Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, the five Yom Tovim, the five Yom Tovs, right? Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, Chag Pesach, Chag Sukkot, and Chag Shavuot. The laws of lighting fire and extinguishing fire are a little less strict, particularly when it comes to cooking. And so one of the questions that gets raised in a 20th century Orthodox She'elah U'Tshuva, question and answer, is whether or not you can turn off your gas burner on a stove, right? Which obviously the rabbis of the 13th and 14th centuries could not have contemplated, because the idea of a gas stove was way beyond their understanding of how the world worked. So in answering the question of whether or not you could extinguish a gas stove on Shabbat, on the festival, the rabbis had to think of similar questions of the medieval period. And they talked about a fire that was burning, that some of the logs were already burning and some of the logs were nearby and not. And they know that Jewish law says that if once a log has caught fire, you cannot extinguish it, but you can move logs away from the fire to prevent them from lighting in the first place. And so then they asked the question, if a gas stove works by there being a constant stream of natural gas to feed an already existing fire, how do we think of that setup vis-a-vis the model of the logs? And what they ultimately realized is that, the gas that flows into your stove originates with the gas company, and it flows down a gas main under the streets, and it flows into the main of your building, and it flows up to your floor, and it flows to the distribution pipe for your floor, and it flows from that pipe into the pipe that goes into your kitchen, and it flows into your kitchen, and it flows into your stove, and it flows to the nozzle that feeds that particular burner. And when you turn the dial, you're actually controlling that nozzle. And the rabbis just realized, the modern rabbis, that what you do when you close that nozzle, oh, by the way, they should say, and all of the gas which is flowing through all of those lines is not yet aflame. If it was, the whole building would be on fire, right? So the gas in there, in the line, is like the log next to the fire, but not yet burning. And they say when you turn off the stove, what you do is you close the nozzle. Any of the gas that's past the nozzle will continue to flow, And you know that when you turn off the nozzle, it takes a fraction of a second for the fire to go out. That's the leftover gas burning off, but you've cut off the gas at the source. And so they say, yes, you can turn off your gas at the nozzle on Yom Tov. The other option, by the way, is just to set a pot of boiling water on it, let it boil over, and then it'll put the gas out, and that turns out by itself. And then you can turn the gas. Anyway, not important. So those are the types of questions, right? You ask a question, the rabbis look at the history of the rabbinic tradition, they look for parallel examples, precedent, you might say, and they ask how it applies. So we have here, let me find it. This got a little complicated. You know what? I'm going to do this for a second. I am going to do a couple of things. I am going to stop the share for one moment. I am going to spotlight myself for just 1 second, and I want to pull up the actual response from the website. All right. Here we go. Coming back at you. Give me one moment. Sorry for the delay. So the responsum itself that was passed by the CCAR was written by Jacob Lauterbach. And, oh, this is the wrong document. Hang on. Sorry. This is the one that I want. That's not it either. Where'd it go? I'm sorry, everybody. Here. So Jacob Lauterbach, who was asked to write the responsum, answers the question in the negative. In 1922, he says, no, women should not be ordained as rabbis. And he basically takes the same position that was always the position of the rabbinic tradition, that women are exempt from time-bound positive commandments, right? It says in the Mishnah at the very beginning of the rabbinic tradition, time-bound positive commandments, things that God tells us to do that are religious in nature and that are meant to be done at a particular point in time. In general, women are exempt from that. Examples of that include doing things like putting on talis and tefillin, right? Or davening at a certain time, or reading Torah, those type of behaviors. The tradition says that women are exempt. And the tradition also says that because women are exempt, that they shouldn't engage in them. And it says that, listen, we all have a lot of things that we're supposed to do. We all have a lot of mitzvot, so many of them, in fact, that it's impossible to do them all. And so the idea, according to the tradition, of taking on additional responsibilities that are not yours is presumptuous, right? Because how could you possibly say, I've done everything the Holy One asks of me, so much so that I'm now going to go do things that God has explicitly exempted me from? That's the position of the rabbinic tradition around women engaging in these particular acts. And Rabbi Lauterbach basically takes that opinion in his arguments, right? And he says, listen, and he also plays in the gender politics of the 1920s. Women should be in the home. Women should be supporting. And he argues that, women can't serve as rabbis because professional opportunities are really not for women, right? Men should take on the professional opportunities. Women should support the family. It's a very, that's really the position that he takes. And if you're scanning this, right, her calling as mother and homemaker, she cannot do both well at the same time, right? The life of the family of the rabbi would not be particularly wholesome, right? Not to mention, if she is to be a mother, she could not go on with her regular activities in the congregation, right? We'll never see forget about, family leave, right? God forbid we have that, right, in the 1920s. There is, in my mind, no injustice done to a woman by excluding her from this office. There are many avenues open to her if she chooses to do religious work or educational work. I can see no reason why we should make this radical departure from traditional practice, except the specious argument that we are modern men. and as such, we recognize the full equality of women to men. Hence, we should be thoroughly consistent. But I would not class the rabbis with those people whose main characteristic is consistency. I cringe. I cringe only because of what happens next. Because the conference, in addition to publishing this, the response, I mean, it was voted on, passed by a majority of the rabbis who were on the committee. The conference also went so far as to record the discussion. And we're going to look at, and I pulled from the continuation of this page and what we're going to look at next, because I want to point out a couple of things. First of all, it was moved and adopted, and this is in the middle of this, it was moved and adopted that the courtesy of the floor be extended to the wives of the rabbis in order to ascertain their views on the subject. It was moved and adopted that the president of the conference, should appoint a committee to formulate a statement which shall express the sentiment that the CCAR has repeatedly made pronouncements using the fullest measures of self-expression for a woman, as well as the full utilization of her gifts in the service of the God Most High, and that it gratefully acknowledges the enrichment and enlargement of congregational life, which has resulted therefrom. So it seems like the conference is ready to say the contribution of half of our community, right, the female half of our community, to Judaism and to God cannot be understated. And yet, we're not quite ready to go and give this office in 1922, except that many, many rabbis around that table were. Whatever may have been the specific legal status of the Jewish woman regarding certain religious function, her general position in religious life has ever been an exalted one. She has been the priestess in the home, and our sages have always recognized her as the preserver of Israel. In view of these Jewish teachings, in keeping with the spirit of our age and tradition of our conference, we declare that a woman cannot justly be denied the privilege of ordination. Now, the language here is not particularly clear, right? Because one of the questions that we have is we have a response penned by Jacob Lauterbach, signed on by some. We have this position of the committee, which says something different, right? This negative, women cannot be denied. But then getting to Robin's question, who is responsible for enforcing this? Enforcement actually goes to the seminary, right? Because just because the CCAR says that we're comfortable having women join our ranks as rabbis, you still need the school to accept them, to matriculate them, to graduate and ordain them, and that didn't happen for another 50 years. But what I want to look at now also is what were the arguments that were made by the rabbis of the CCAR in the 1920s and see how much they resonate with today. The question resolves itself in the following two parts. This is the middle paragraph. The attitude of traditional Judaism on this point, and second, whether Reform Judaism should follow tradition, right? We know what the tradition says. The tradition says, nay, right? The tradition says women, because they are exempt from this, and this is Lauterbach's argument, because they're exempt, they can't be responsible for doing these acts. You can't lead a community in worship if your participation in that worship is a violation of that exemption, right? By the way, it's the same reason why children can't, right? Children can't lead the service because they're not obligated to participate in it in the same way until they're bar bat mitzvah, which is why we celebrate bar bat mitzvah by giving them the opportunity to lead the service, because now they can. Now we come to the second part. Shall we adhere to this tradition, or shall we separate ourselves from Catholic Israel and introduce a radical innovation which would necessarily create a distinction between the title rabbi, as held by a Reform rabbi, and the title rabbi held by rabbis in general, right? Which, by the way, is the question today. Not every Orthodox rabbi, Catholic rabbi, calls our rabbis rabbi. The good ones do. Our friends at Boca Raton Synagogue do. And that's really, really important. Going the wrong way. Right? And this is the Lauterbach piece. There's no injustice by excluding her. I would not, this is the last piece I just read. Here are the other pieces of the discussion. Rabbi Levinger, I feel very strongly on this question. When we look at the various denominations in this country, we are opposed to ordaining women as ministers. We find that there are those who, like the Episcopalians and the Catholics, look upon their ministers as priests, right? And by priest, they mean this conduit to the Holy One, right? By priest, they mean a class who is spiritually separate from the rest of the people. They exist in an intermediate space between the people and God. To us, the rabbi is merely a teacher and a preacher, right? What Levinger is doing is he's recognizing that the role of the rabbi is not spiritually separate from the rest of the community. It's from within the community. It's the learned one who teaches and preaches, but is not that conduit in a way that a priest might. The question is not whether there are a great many women who want to become rabbis. Perhaps there are none at all. But we are called upon to act on a manner of principle. And if in the next 30 or 40 years, we produce but one Anna Howard Shaw, we want her in the rabbinate. In 1922, he says, even if there isn't a woman who wants to become a rabbi, our position should be that when that woman presents herself, we should recognize her. He was short 10 years, right? It was 50 years. But in 1922, the forward-thinking rabbi, in 1922. Another argument. Rabbi Witt, I was present at the meeting of the Board of Governors when the matter came up. This is the college of HUC. And it was decided to refer to the conference. The college doesn't want to answer the question about Jewish law. They kick it to the CCAR, which is how we find ourselves here. After reading the responses that were prepared by Rabbi Lauterbach, I feared there would be much opposition. I trust our action in this manner would be unanimous. It is not a matter of tradition at all. I must confess, I was not at least the least interested in Rabbi Lauterbach's presentation. It seemed reactionary to me. I did not feel that it was the proper presentation on the subject. I need not say that I honor him for the learning contained therein, but the point he presents is not the point at issue. We have witnessed the revolution in the status of women. 5 years ago, I had to argue in favor of women's rights when that question came up in the Arkansas legislature. But I did not feel that it would be a need to argue that in a liberal body of men like this. There was a principle involved, and I hope that we stand and take one in line with all of the progressive tendencies of our day, that we have the vision to see what is before us. From the standpoint of today, should we say to women that they should not have the right to function as we are functioning? The question is, he continues, how have they do they have the qualifications to function? Oh, too far. What does it require to be a spiritual guide? It requires great spirit and the quality of leadership. Some women have it, some don't. Some have it, some men have it, some have not. If we had great leadership, we would not have the question of we were so ably presented yesterday among the practical questions of the ministry. I love when they use Christian words like ministry. The one thing that was stressed was that if we had devoted leaders who could inspire the following, all the problem would vanish. I believe this body of men should do nothing that would stand in the way of any forward movement on behalf of womanhood in America. I cannot believe that a religion that is so splendidly spiritual and forward-thinking as our religion will stand in the way of such a movement. I feel that this conference can act only in one way, and that is to fall in line with what is the destiny of women of the future. Rabbi Newmark, and he really takes it apart. The fact that she was exempt from certain obligations, she could not represent the congregation in the performance of such duties. He's citing from the Talmud why, the Mishnah and Talmud, the rule against women serving as rabbis. Against this argument, the following can be said. First, the traditional functionings of the rabbi have nothing to do with the representation of the congregation in the performance of certain religious duties from which women are freed. There are certain categories of men, such as deformed and afflicted with certain bodily defects, which could not act as readers, but could be rabbis for the decisions of ritual matters and a question of law. The same holds people with a foreign accent. His point being the traditional duties that the rabbinic law forbids women from doing, forbade other men from doing. And what a modern rabbi does is not just those things. They do other things. Second, women are not free from the duties of prayer, of Birkat Hamazon, grace after the meal, and Kiddush, and they can read for others. Thus, even in our modern conception of the function of the rabbi, which includes reading, women can act as representing according to traditional law. Of course, the word tefillah here means the Amidah, the Shemona Esrei, the 18 prayers, while prayer is meaning the divine service had the Shema in its center, and a woman was freed from its obligatory reading. But no Orthodox Jew has ever waited with the reading of the Shema for the public service. They do it on their own anyway. It has, at least in post-Talmudic times, always been done right in the morning privately, right? If you're worried about the way the tradition would think of women rabbis, you got to ask yourself, how do those Jews practice? They don't do those worship pieces with the leadership of a rabbi. They do it on their own. You don't need a rabbi. And if that's your prohibition to women serving as rabbis, now you're contradicting yourself. So what's the problem? He argues. Third, the practice within Reform Judaism has decided in favor of admitting women as readers of the divine service. And since we are interested in the traditional law on the subject only in order to take from it a clue for Reform practice, this argument would be of no consequence, even if it were valid, as it is not. If a woman is to be debarred from the rabbinate in Orthodox Judaism because she cannot serve as a reader, then the only logical consequence would be that Reform Judaism, which has decided in the favor of the woman reader, should disregard the Orthodox attitude and admit women to the rabbinates. Don't let what the Orthodox care about matter to us. The reason why a Torah scroll written by a woman was considered unfit is not, as Dr. Lauterbach claims, because she could not be a reader of the Torah, but a formal one. Whosoever has not the obligation of binding, of tefillin, has not the fitness of writing a Torah scroll, it says in Gitin and in Menachot. The above reason is given in Sofrim, but there a woman is not debarred from writing a Torah scroll. And again, what he's saying is, who cares? Who cares about this? These laws. We don't apply these laws elsewhere. Why should we apply it here? In Moed Katan 18a, does not say that women are not to be found in the academies and the colleges where the rabbis assembled and where the students prepared themselves to be rabbis. It is said, Isha be midrasha la shechichka. A woman is not often found to be found in the Beit HaMidrash. The academies and colleges of these days were not institutions of training of rabbis, but institutions of learning. Most of those students were pursuing other vocations. Women in those days were supposed to keep away from all public places, such as courts and the like, and even as much as possible from the streets. Kol kevoda bat melech penima, right? His point being, it says in the Talmud that women shouldn't often go to the study hall. But the modern day rabbinical school is not the Beit Midrash of the rabbinic period. It's a different institution. Very few men were going to the study hall. They went after their other things as well. This is a professionalized world. You can't use those principles of then, which was seeing Torah study as an avocation, not as a vocation, to apply it to the question of a vocational school, which the rabbinical school is of many things. It's a vocational school. It is a Beit Midrash. It is a seminary. It's all those things. But in part, it's a vocational school. As to the direct question of the legal situation, I have discussed the matter in the opinion which I have submitted to the faculty of the Hebrew Union College. I want to add the following remarks. One, the statement in the Yerushalmi Sanhedrin 21c. Too far. Go back. Here we go. That a woman cannot serve occasionally as a judge is not from a Baraita, not from a writing from the Midrashic period, excuse me, from the Mishnaic period that was found in the Tosefta, as Dr. Lauterbach claims, but a discussion between two Amoraim. Lamadnu does not mean we have learned, but is a technical term for an inference on the virtue of a hermeneutical rule. In this case, Gezerah Shava. He's getting technical here. This is rabbinic legalese. But what he's saying is, Lauterbach, you're applying the law wrong. You're applying the hermeneutical principles wrong, right? Nowhere in Talmudic, but always by Tanya literature, right? These Baraitim, a Baraita is introduced by Tanai or Lamadnu, right? It's introduced as in other ways. The emphasis on men in the quotation from Maimonides that Lauterbach uses is not justified. As to the practical question of the advisability to ordain women at HUC, I do not believe that the Orthodox will have any reason to object. They themselves employ women in their schools as teachers and readers, and our women rabbis will not do more than this. In fact, the entire question reduces it to this. Women are already doing most of the work that the ordained woman rabbi is expected to do, but they do it without preparation, meaning having the educational background, and without authority. I consider it rather a duty of the authorities to put an end to the prevailing anarchy by giving women a chance to acquire adequate education and an authoritative standing in all branches of religious work. The practical difficulties cannot be denied, but they will be worked out in the same way as in other professions, especially in the teaching profession, from the kindergarten to postgraduate schools. Lydia Rabinowitz raised a family of 3 and kept up a full measure of family life while being a professor of bacteriology. Women can do it as well as men can. All they need is the time and training. So let's give it to them. The woman who will remain single will not be more, in fact, less of a problem than the bachelor rabbi. If she marries and chooses to remain a rabbi, God bless her. She'll retire for a few months, provide a substitute, just as rabbis generally do when they are sick or involved in an accident. Family leave, parental leave. In 1922, he's arguing for. When she comes back, she'll be a better rabbi for the experience. The rabbinate may help women, and women may help the rabbinates. You cannot treat the Reform rabbinate from the Orthodox point of view. Orthodoxy is orthodoxy, reform is reform. Our good relations with our Orthodox brethren may still be improved upon a clear and decided stand on this question. They want us either to be reform or to return to the fold of real, genuine Orthodox whence we come. What are we going to do? We're going to stay reform. Questions, comments, observations? What took us so long? Alan, go ahead. You're on mute still.
So how does this tie in with we had that wonderful discussion with the Orthodox woman rabbi a few weeks ago. I don't know if you were on it. It was Sisterhood brought in the Orthodox woman rabbi. Essentially, she's like the only one or something like that. I can't quite figure out how that. I almost can't even figure out how that happened. And I know she went through the story, but with the vehemence with which Lauterbach portrayed it, he was reform. I can't even imagine what the Orthodox would say. They would say, I'm not even going to answer the question.
So 99.5% of Orthodox rabbis do that, right? Although there are women who identify as Orthodox and have been granted the title of rabbi, that is not generally accepted within Orthodoxy, right? And when it's easy to think of Orthodoxy as being a monolithic institution, but it's not, right? There there are the couple of monolithic institutions like the Orthodox Union and the Rabbinical Council of America, which is the Orthodox CCAR, and Yeshiva University. You know, the modern Orthodoxy kind of has that same three-pronged step of the seminary, the synagogue organization, and the rabbinical organization. None of those institutions recognize those women as rabbi, right? It's a breakaway group. There's this notion called open orthodoxy that some Orthodox rabbis have been engendering and are building sort of their own community. And they're really creating their own community that is, in their mind, they're Orthodox because they're mitzvah observant. But they take many of the reasoning that we see in this reasoning, which is that the things that the tradition says women are exempt from are not the things that a rabbi does, right? It doesn't say that women are exempt from studying Torah or learning Talmud or making positions and explaining what the law is, which is the role of the rabbi in the Orthodox community, right? Those women may be rabbis who are not going to be leading the davening at their synagogue. But you go to more conservative synagogues, the rabbi doesn't lead the davening. Somebody else does, right? Maybe they have a chazan, maybe they have a lay leader, right? The idea of being the shliach tzibur, of being the service leader,
leads the davening.
and that being the responsibility of the rabbi is in some ways pretty reform, right? Because of that, because of the way that our movement operates. In more traditional communities, the Rav is not the one who's leading the davening day in, day out, right? They'll give the sermon, the drasha, whatever in the middle, but that's not forbidden from women, right? And that's the narrow way. So what's going on in Orthodoxy is there's this somewhat legally grounded cultural prohibition in mainstream Orthodoxy, and then the small stream Orthodoxy who says the cultural prohibition is no longer valid. We can't hold on to that anymore for many of the same reasons that my colleagues of 100 years ago were saying, which is, unless you can tell me why what they're doing is explicitly forbidden, you can't forbid it. And by the way, we're Reform. We don't care 100% what the tradition says. We are interested in wondering whether or not we ought to bind ourselves to those traditional prohibitions, right? I mean, it's crazy. You're a Reform movement who is asking men not to put on tefillin, and then you say women can't be rabbis because they can't put on tefillin, right? It's an easier sell for us in the 20s, in the 50s, in the 70s, in 2020, right? Because Orthodoxy still does have the prohibition or the women being exempt from tefillin, but even for open Orthodoxy and Rabbi Weiss, it's not a problem to get them to serving as a rabbi, because you don't have to put on tefillin to serve as a rabbi in the way that their rabbis function. Shirley.
I wanted to ask about to me, it's somewhat relevant, but wasn't there a similar controversy about when women could read Torah on the Bima or celebrate Bat Mitzvah?
All of
and
it.
How much later was that? Because the comment I was going to make is there was a time when we belonged to a conservative synagogue, and at that time, women were not allowed to celebrate Bat Mitzvah until the rabbi had twins, one of whom was a female.
Yeah.
And at that point, the policy got changed so that both twins could
Right.
read the Torah.
So those actions, like reading from Torah and leading the davening, those are the types of behaviors that the tradition says those are things that women are exempt from. And that exemption was used for several hundreds, if not thousands of years, to say, because they're exempt, they should not engage in those behaviors. And it was in the middle of the 20th century, starting with Reform Jews, and then ultimately conservative Jews who, and now a little bit of Orthodox, are saying we should no longer interpret that exemption to be a prohibition. That's one piece of this, right? It doesn't say in the Mishnah of the Talmud, women may not read from Torah. It says that they are exempt from Torah. And then this cultural prohibition of saying, well, it'd be presumptuous to engage in a behavior that you're exempt from, and so you can't do it. And basically what happened is we got over ourselves, right? And the cultural push of feminism, and I use that word intentionally, right, which led to things like young women becoming bat mitzvah and becoming, professionals and all those different things, overwhelmed the opposition, right? And what I love about this argument of the rabbis is saying that they're worried about 1920 and how they're going to look in 1940 and how they're going to look in 1960 and how they're going to look in 1980 and how they're going to look in 2020. They're forward thinking because they see us as being the progressive movement. So it's all kind of tied in together. Margaret.
Along with the story about the twins, I can't remember if it was like 73 or 74. We had the second female rabbi come to Charlotte, my congregation, and we always had a joint Thanksgiving service with the conservative synagogue. Mm-hmm. There was a big uproar about having her on the bima because she might have a Torah, she might have her period. It was a whole thing at that time.
Yeah.
That's what went on.
So there's the other piece of it is there was always this anti-feminist, misogynist belief in parts of the tradition that mostly around the idea of menstruation, that menstruating women could somehow defile the religious objects, right? The bima, the ark, the Torah. And yet it's very clear in the tradition that it says over and over and over again that there is no way to defile a Torah, right? When you look at the laws of ritual purity and ritual impurity, it says that there's nothing that you can do to a Torah to make it ritually impure. It does not, lo mikabel tuma, it does not receive impurity, right? There's nothing nothing that you can do to a Torah scroll to make it ritually impure, right? Right. And even if a woman who has had her menstrual period and hasn't immersed in mikvah, if you want to call her being tumat or being impure, she can't affect it. But it was used as a cudgel against progressive feminist goals in many, many different communities. We're not going to get a chance to look at patrilineal descent, but I would say that was another example where the reform movement looking for equality between the genders and not so much caring about what other movements said. We're going to do what we think is right. It's worth reading. It's available on the CCR website. You can Google it. It was from 1983, but we are past time. Maybe for a different class in a different era. Thank you everyone for joining in over the last 4 weeks. I hope that our celebration of this nation's 244th birthday a week ago was made more meaningful by the study of the American Jewish community and moments in our history.
Thank you.